Talking about mental health can be uncomfortable, particularly if you're from a culture or background where those discussions don't really happen. However, with COVID, a number of cultures and people of all kinds have started having discussions about mental health that maybe didn't have them as frequently before. One particular discussion that I'm familiar with now is one around attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Our next speaker, who works as a art director, advocate, and fantasy illustrator for Wizards of the Coast, comes to us with a talk about the intersection of mental health and blackness. Please welcome to the stage Lauren Brown.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lauren Brown. I'm currently an art director at Wizards of the Coast, and I have ADHD. So this talk is going to be about ADHD while Black, braving your own brain, because I know that a lot of us have experienced ADHD in the past, especially us creatives, and we have en masse been diagnosed way later than a lot of people have. So this talk is all about what to do when you have ADHD, how to brave your own brain, and also how to maximize what your brain has given you. And I am not a medical professional. I am speaking only from experience. So I just want to put that disclaimer up front that any professional official advice should come from a medical professional. So just FYI, I am just an artist. A little bit about me. I am a BFA graduate of Montclair State and an MFA graduate of Savannah College of Art and Design in illustration. I started my career at Floyd County Productions, which is an animation studio in Atlanta. And I worked on Archer, Always Sunny in Philadelphia, The League, Unsupervised, a bunch of other shows there as a background artist and to a background director. Then I moved on to work at Electronic Arts on things like The Simpsons Tapped Out, Star Wars Rise to Power as a senior environment artist and essentially almost an art director. And I went on to become an art director at Zynga on Harry Potter, Puzzles and Spells, and Words with Friends. I currently am living in Atlanta as an art director for Wizards of the Coast, working on the digital marketing team. And if you've seen the Wilds of Eldraine stuff that just came out, I worked on some of those things. And I also have a podcast called the Paint and Color Podcast, which I'm going to talk about at the end of the show. If you're interested in art advice or just advice for creatives, please check that out. And the biggest thing about me and relevant to this panel is, again, I have ADHD. This and doesn't really know all about ADHD. What is ADHD? ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's apparently 7 different types of ADHD, which actually I didn't know that. So I'm going to talk about the main 2 types of ADHD, which is classic hyperactive and inattentive, which is the more internal lack of focus one. It impacts several different areas of how we interact with life, our brains, how we process and think. It comes into play about emotion, about memory, focus, mood, learning. Literally everything in our lived experience is impacted by our having ADHD. But we are often functional members of society as well, and we have not typically displayed a lot of the traits that are associated with inattentive, that are wide open, that people notice, and therefore we tend to get diagnosed at way lower rates than people with hyperactive ADHD. Inattentive is much more about just not paying attention in class, needing to draw or do something with your hands while listening to something. And it impacts our internal processing rather than having to move around and bounce around all the time. A lot of people recognize ADHD as the very active, hyperactive one, but that is more commonly seen in males than it is in females or feminine or femme presenting people, people who are raised female. So this one, this experience that I have is going to be much more focused on the inattentive because that's the one that creatives tend to exhibit a lot more frequently. So when we are young, the issue, again, about inattentive is that not only does it get diagnosed way less, but that Black children just en masse get diagnosed way less than white children do. And it's 69% less. And I typoed in that slide. Please ignore that. So when we are undiagnosed, what tends to happen is that we tend to internalize a lot of the criticisms that we have had when we're growing up as children. We tend to think it's a moral failing that we've left things behind, or that we can't pay attention in class, or that we interrupt people or overtalk, or we just function in the ways that people don't tend to function around us if they are neurotypical. And what we have thought happened was that, oh, if only I could be, functioning this way, or if only I could remember, I would be better, or I would be good. And we tend to have confidence issues because of that. In my personal case, I've tended to overcompensate, and try to fill my schedule with a bunch of stuff so that I can create pressure for myself, or have to prove myself in order to be good enough for, any different realm to be excellent. And when we are Black, we are all about trying to be as excellent as possible, and we want to be magical. But however, we need to rest, and we need to recharge our batteries. And oftentimes, we don't tend to give ourselves that grace because we think that we have to keep up with our own disorder. And it's not even a disorder; it's just a brain function, an essential brain function. I've also shared some old art here as well to show that our ADHD can be powerful. This is art that I did as a kid, and I believe thoroughly that I wouldn't be able to create the way that I created if I didn't have ADHD. We think out of the box. We have a unique lived experience, and we jump tracks on our brain that nobody else can seem to follow. And we talk about, like, we come out with like random things out of our own brains that people are like, where did that come from? Like, why did you? And so we make associations that jump immediately. And that leads us to have amazing thought processes and shake things up. We think of very creative ways to solve problems. We think of different worlds and possibilities and beautiful things in our own head. And so, ADHD, the reason why I say it's not a disorder is because it gives us a unique, powerful insight that a lot of people don't tend to have. This is why a lot of creatives are ADHDers. And this is why people, tend to be really impressed with us. Some of us have done really badly in school, but others have done really well in school because we tend to hyper focus on the things that give us pleasure and give us joy and dopamine. And in my case, art was the thing that gave me pleasure and dopamine. And therefore, I was able to fully immerse myself into that world and have an insight that was uniquely my own. One second. So I think that overall, even though ADHD can lead to a lot of mishaps with interacting with other people, it can tend to create a beautiful lived experience for each of us that lend itself to our own unique minds, and we lend that to the different things that we work on and different companies that we work for. We are valuable to have in this world. But because we are so valuable and because we're so cool, we also have the drive to prove ourselves. And we, again, are pressured to be excellent at all times. And this often leads us into burnout and into, cycles of anxiety, depression, low motivation. And so we have to understand how to balance our brains because we cannot be this all the time. We tend to set crazy goals for ourselves. We tend to say we tend to think that we can shoot for the stars, and oftentimes we can, but we also need to understand that we can rest and that we can be just a human being and not somebody who's doing and doing all the time. This is a product of overachievement, and also can be comorbid with ADHD, like so many different things can. I have found also that over the pandemic, a lot of people have started getting diagnosed with ADHD. So my personal experience has been, I have worked for 12 years in this industry now as a game developer, as an animator, and I have been performing and performing and performing and doing and doing and doing. Aside from doing my full-time work, I have been doing conventions. I've been doing freelance. I had an Etsy shop. I had been doing my own personal stuff. And what that tended to lead to was a slow, culminating burnout that built itself up over time. I am a very productive person. And what I realized was that when a lot of my outlets were taken away, that productivity had tanked harshly because I didn't have any external places to go. And that was over the pandemic. In 2020, we're stuck in our houses. We lost the ability to socialize in person. We lost the ability to go out to the gym and exercise. We lost thrilling experiences and the ability to travel. And some of our creative endeavors were suddenly limited to us because we couldn't go to external places. What that created was this cycle of burnout, this ADHD lack of focus, and all of our dopamine has suddenly dropped, because what ADHD is a deficiency of dopamine. When we have things that we don't find pleasure in, we don't want to do them. It becomes way harder for us to do things that are mundane, like cleaning and cooking sometimes, and just doing general things that everybody seems to be able to do, but we can't do them. Now that all of our external outlets that give us dopamine are taken away from us, we had lost all of that motivation to do the things that are right in front of us at home. And that created a huge wave in people actually getting diagnosed for ADHD, because we had no choice but to realize, like, we can't focus on anything. What is happening? For me, I saw way too many relatable memes, and my burnout had caught up with me full force because all those coping mechanisms were taken away. So I took it upon myself to seek out a therapist and seek out a psychiatrist. And I got diagnosed by two people when I was 35 years old, and had to confront the fact that I had had ADHD my whole life. And I was making these connections of realizing that all these different patterns were just ADHD, the forgetting, the leaving, things around, except for my sketchbook. My mom would be like, you always have your sketchbook with you. Why can't you remember anything else? And I realized that I had been trying to work my entire career super hard to focus and to compensate for my lack of organization and lack of attention and lack of motivation. All that was just ADHD, and I was trying to run from it rather than trying to cope with it. And over the pandemic, what also had happened was that it was comorbid with anxiety and depression. So I was super anxious. I was depressed because I couldn't go anywhere. I was worried about my family, and that really fed into all these different things. And if anybody has experienced that same thing over the pandemic, please let me know in the chat, and please share your experiences. So what do we do about it? What do we do when ADHD seems to be overwhelming our lives, when we can't focus, when we're at work and we can't seem to get it together, and when we're freelancers or just working on projects and we can't seem to meet deadlines? What do we do about it? So the biggest thing I want to ask everybody is, how does your brain work? I think the biggest part of coping with your own ADHD is actually knowing yourself and knowing who you are as a person and being honest with yourself. I think oftentimes a lot of people don't realize that they are trying to fit their brain with neurotypical society when they are in fact neurodiverse. And that neurodiversity works in our own unique way. For example, and this is a silly example, but this is very true. I know that I struggle with object permanence, as a lot of ADHD people do. What that means is that if something is out of sight, it is out of mind. For example, my refrigerator. If anything is in the drawer and it's closed and I can't see it, that thing will be forgotten until a few weeks later when I finally deign to open that drawer and realize that food has rotted. What I have done to compensate for that is I put everything out of the drawer and I organize the fridge from tallest stuff in the back to the smallest stuff in the front, so that I can see everything and that I remember that everything is in the fridge. It is a simple thing, but boy, does it work. So think about how you best function and how you perform at your best. Do you work better at night? Make stuff at night. Don't try to pressure yourself into being a morning person because you think it's morally good and morally well. Work at night. It's okay, as long as you're getting enough rest, because rest is really important, y'all. Seriously. Get enough rest, but work at night, and work when your brain works the best. Work when your brain turns on and you actually want to function. Another huge thing is advocating for yourself, not just at work, not just in freelance, but just for other people. I am the kind of person who, again, object permanence extends to not just objects, but people. If people are not around directly, sometimes I'll forget to communicate with them for like weeks on end. I try my best, therefore, because I know myself, to set the stage and let them know, hey, I will probably forget to contact you. So I will either try to set an alarm or just ask the person to forgive me. This is the way I am. If you can't function that way, I will try to do my best to accommodate for you, but I cannot guarantee, because my entire life I have been like this way. I am working on it, but this is how we are. So understanding how you function and how you work is really important for communicating that to other people. So what I say is that if you are at work and you know that you just like physically cannot work at a certain time of day, perhaps there's a way to accommodate for that. Ask your boss, hey, maybe twice a week or once a week. Is it possible if I can work later and work my same amount of hours, but a little bit later? It's really hard for me to focus during the day, or it's hard for me to focus when these conditions are here. Is it possible if I could work at night? The worst that they can say is no. And then you figure out how to function within that. But if they say yes, that is another thing in your favor of allowing you to work at your most optimal. Your environment is also really, really important. So try to create something that, like an environment that makes you happy, whether you're working in an external office, whether you have to work in your bedroom, whether you work in a studio. Put beautiful things around you, things that make you happy, things that keep you motivated. Because when your space is cluttered, that creates anxiety for yourself. That creates, tension. You don't feel comfortable if your space is not comfortable. So, and again, it's okay if your space gets messy, because we all get a little bit messy sometimes. We will clean it. It will be fine. But overall, make your space optimal to work in, because otherwise it's going to be very hard for you to focus and to function. And the biggest thing is that your coping mechanisms, again, are unique to you and who you are. Understand how you work, understand how you function. And I suggest writing it down, but if you don't, talk to somebody about it. Just try your best to work with how your own brain works. I also highly recommend, cannot recommend enough, touching grass. Go outside. Now that we are in, post-lockdown society, pandemic is still on, but post-lockdown is happening. We have more options to go outside and actually do things, and not just go outside, but actually vary up our day to day. We tend to get stuck in social media land, doom scrolling on Twitter or whatever it is, and we tend to get stuck in cycles that perpetuate themselves. And comorbidity means that ADHD feeds into depression and anxiety. That same thing happens with those cycles of depression. We get stuck scrolling in social media because that's the only thing that gives us the dopamine hit, right? Instant gratification. What that does is that then we feel guilty about having scrolled on social media and not being productive. That guilt leads into anxiety that we're not doing anything, but we also can't motivate ourselves to do anything because we are not having enough dopamine to do anything else outside of scrolling on social media, which leads into depression. Try to find that cycle and break it. Break it immediately. The best way to break it is to vary up your routine. Go outside. If you feel like you're starting to get down on yourself and you're starting to get demotivated, then try your best to recognize when that happens and what that looks like, and go out, do something else, do literally anything else. Find external outlets, find ways to have creative pursuits. Sometimes we deal with burnout, and burnout takes our thing that we have typically enjoyed and typically have gotten dopamine from, and it takes the dopamine away. What you do when you have burnout is you have to find another outlet, another creative endeavor while we're recharging the well for that one endeavor that we can't really motivate ourselves to do right now. So part of that is finding an external source, going outside, being social with people, play a board game, talk with loved ones, even talk with chat. If you really need to motivate yourself to work on the thing that you're not motivated to yourself, you're not motivated to do, a good thing to do is called body doubling. What body doubling is the ability to work with somebody else. That can be in person or just over chat. I've done this so many times, and I cannot recommend this enough, because what it does is that there's somebody external that's keeping you accountable when you can't be accountable for yourself, or when you can't motivate yourself enough to work. And that creates enough of an external factor for you to actually get things done, especially if you're talking and your brain is doing something else. It helps you focus better on the task at hand, and it helps you accomplish that task. So try to vary up your outlets, try to go outside, and try to keep yourself motivated. Working on teams is a really good way to do this too. In game development, we have to often be accountable for each other and what we're working on as well. We have to check in with each other and see that the project is getting done. Having that team, be on chat or at least be there to hold you accountable is a really good way to continue to work on the thing that you're working on. But I cannot recommend enough touching grass. This piece of art, for example, that I created was an example of touching grass. I went outside, I saw ginkgo trees, and I created a ginkgo queen from that experience. So having external experiences outside of your continuous lived one, you're going like staying inside or being on the computer, that really does feed into your creativity and your mind and your thought process. So go outside and touch some grass. Also, fighting guilt is really important. I think that oftentimes because we have ADHD and because we think that our own experiences are often not good enough because we try to fit into a neurotypical world, that we feel very guilty for dropping tasks, jumping trains of thought, just like the ways that we typically function and the ways our brain works seems to be something that needs to be, explained or excused away. I think that it's really important to understand, again, how you work and what your tendencies are and work with those tendencies. One of the most important things I did was get therapy. And I know in the Black community, we really don't, like it's starting to become more prevalent, which is nice. But a lot of us were raised typically with the mindset that, therapy wasn't something that was for us, or therapy was something to be stigmatized, that you only need when you're at your lowest low, or that you have some crazy mental issues. And that's not true. First off, therapy is amazing for everybody. And therapy is really, really good for ADHD brains because it teaches us cognitive behavioral techniques that allow us to work on the things that we need to work on in terms of how our brains function and how to work with our brains in our unique way. And that includes, and not limited to, forgetting to do the daily thing that you set out to do. Habit forming is very difficult for us. And I think it's really important to know that our habits are not going to look the same as neurotypical habits. Getting up and doing a thing daily at the exact same time every day is something that a lot of ADHD brains are just simply not tailored towards. And what we do instead is understand that sometimes we're not going to be able to keep a habit, and that's okay. What we do instead is we try a habit, and it might work for a month, it might work for 3 months, and then suddenly we skip a day. And because a lot of ADHD brains are an all or nothing mentality, the moment that we skip the day, we think that, oh, I guess I can never do that thing again. Like, I guess like this habit's just not for me anymore. Sometimes it really isn't for you, and that's okay. You've tried the habit, you've accomplished what you set out to accomplish within whatever time frame you did it, and now it's time for a new good habit. So instead of feeling guilty about whatever habit you thought you weren't going to do, you can move on to a new kind of thing, a new routine, a new, experience. If you can't do a routine, that's fine too. Try to strive to do something different every day. That's good for you. That's good for you to feed into yourself. If you can form a habit, if you're one of the lucky few, stick with it and know that, this habit is good for you, and that whatever unique thing that you decide to stick with, that is for you. And if people judge you for it, there's no big deal. That's yours. That's your thing, and it works best for you. For example, in my experience, I have been able to do something called Inktober, which is a 30-day challenge for the entire month of October. I did that challenge 3 times, and I tried it last year and I tried it the year before, and I couldn't do it anymore. And instead of guilting myself out of doing it, I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to ink whenever I feel like inking, and I'm going to try to strive to make an ink drawing like, once a month or twice a month or whatever. And I was able to do that. I've also been able to create a lot of art right before an event. And while it's not great to be able to create from a place of stress and anxiety, because that's like oftentimes the only place that we can create from, that I still understand that that's one of the optimal ways my brain can work. And if I need to activate that drive, I will activate it. And I can create miracles sometimes in the 11th hour, as can a lot of us. And again, if you're listening to this, like, and if there's a live chat or whatever, please feel free to react to that, because I know that a lot of us are like that, where we make the best work right before the due date is happening. For example, I made this slideshow probably an hour before this talk. So whoops, but that's how my brain works. So I understand that, and I know to work with it, and I know what I'm capable of. Again, knowing yourself is very important. The problem with that is that oftentimes we get burned out. And when we're burned out, we need to rest. Rest is nothing to be ashamed of. Rest is nothing to be guilty of. We are so often pressured to function at 1000% all the time. And when we're Black, we really, really have that drive to perform twice as better, 4 times as better, or 4 times as good, because we have to compete with a world where we often get undervalued and underestimated for what we can do. So we have to do even harder than everybody else does. And we are capable of doing that, but we also need to rest while we're capable. And rest is as productive, if not more productive, than actually doing the thing. Because once you properly rested, and I mean properly rested, not the guilty rest that you feel when you're like, oh, like, I guess I should rest. I should sit down and binge watch this show. And all the while you're feeling that guilt of, I should be doing something. I ought to be doing something. But real lived rest where your brain is actually peaceful and you're not feeling that guilt. What does that look like for you? Once again, does it require you to get out the house? Does it require you to go somewhere else? Who knows? But rest looks different for everybody. Know what real rest is for yourself. Fight that guilt of rest. You should not feel guilty when you rest. It's so important. If you have a big deadline coming up and you know who you are, if you have a big deadline coming up and you know that you're going to miss it, or that you know you have to work in the 11th hour, instead of trying to force it at the last minute, communicate that. Tell people that, hey, is it possible that I can get an extension? Is it possible that we can work around this? And you will be surprised how often the answer is yes. As a freelancer, I've had to do this so many different times, and I cannot tell you how important it is to just communicate to whoever it is that you're working with, your client, your boss, whoever that is. Let them know, hey, I am struggling right now. Is there a way that we can work with this? And you can get more people on deck. You can get somebody to help you. You can get that deadline extended, and you can breathe and rest a little easier. Don't let that guilt build up and stop you from communicating something essential, because there is nothing worse than a missed deadline that is not communicated. Communicate your struggles, and it's okay to get help. Please get help. It's very, very hard for us who've worked so independently and so hard to ask for help, but I cannot stress enough how big that is. Because we don't always need to be excellent, and that's okay, because we're magic, but we need to rest and recharge that magic to be magical the next day, and magical the next week and month and years to come. If you are only working in a place of stress and struggle, you're not going to be able to work at your most optimal, and we're not going to be our best selves. And sometimes we need the allowance to not be our best selves. And when we're not our best selves, we can take it a little bit easier and come back fighting when we feel better, because we set unrealistic expectations for ourselves all the time. This is a very, very ADHD tendency, because we tend to see the entirety of the scope rather than breaking up whatever it is in pieces. So we have to start by chunking out our goals into manageable bits and saying, okay, I want to be president. And in order to be president, here's what I actually have to do. First, I have to study, or first, I have to go to law school, or whatever that would be. You have to understand that things come in pieces, and we cannot do every single thing at once. And because our brains work the way we do, we always try to strive for the most high excellent part of ourselves, and that's great for us. But we need to know that we're still human, and we need to know that we have limits, and that's okay. Not meeting those goals does not mean that you have failed. You are on a journey and a path, and you are setting out to create and do something more. And on that path, we are going to have stumbling blocks. we're going to have setbacks. We're going to have moments of doubt and demotivation. And a path forward to create something better is almost never, ever a straight line. It's going to look like this crazy grid. It's going to look like, these like this huge sine wave rather than a straight trajectory up. Know that almost nobody has that straight path. And this is especially true for our ADHD brains. We have to allow ourselves to have that winding path as long as those goals can be met in the end, or some version of that goal can be met in the end. And oftentimes the goal changes as we're on that journey. We think that something that we want in front of us is what we want, but as we're on that path, it changes and transforms. And that's okay. You're still accomplishing something, you're still making something. And even if you're not, you still lived an experience and learned from something. You have to keep that learning mindset in hand so that even as we struggle and even as we have setbacks, I don't want to say failures because failures sound so absolute. We are still learning something and we're still growing from just being alive. So let ourselves be alive, let yourself be human, and let yourself experience whatever you're experiencing and enjoy that path and that journey. And once again, it is okay to ask for help along the way. Therapy is really, really important. If you find that you cannot work past your demotivation and past your lack of focus and past any of your symptoms of ADHD, then medication is also something that's worth exploring. It's not for everybody, but the stigmas about medication are very prevalent. And I think that whatever works for your brain will work. And I can't like tell you enough how much I used to like feel this way about medication, where I was terrified of it until one of my friends told me that medication is like having glasses for your brain when you have ADHD. And that means that we have an actual deficiency in our brains of dopamine. And sometimes we need to compensate for that deficiency with an actual stimulant or an actual, uh, like a suitable replacement for whatever that dopamine deficiency is. Sometimes we can also compensate for that with cognitive behavioral therapy and learning better coping mechanisms. But if those don't always work, medication is totally okay. And I was on medication as well, and it's fine. So it's your personal choice whether or not you want to do it. But you at least have somebody telling you that maybe try to explore it if it's really, really hard and if it's impacting your life to have ADHD, especially in this post-pandemic or post-lockdown world. So it's an avenue worth exploring. And lastly, if you want to hear more about this experience and what it is like to have ADHD as an artist, I have a podcast called Painted in Color, and it is an art focused podcast that is aimed to uplift marginalized artists, and it's created by marginalized artists in the community. This panel specifically is about creating with ADHD, and it's by some amazing special. It's done by amazing special guests and our panelists who talk about our lived experiences, talking about being, a person of color or being Black with ADHD, and understanding how to cope and work and learn with our ADHD. But overall, our brains are beautiful. We are amazing. And we need to know that we cannot work the way that neurotypical people work, and that's all right. But we are often made to be forced into a neurotypical society. And within that, how do we best work? The answer is in knowing yourself and then working with yourself and also asking for help. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope this is really helpful. I hope that my rambling wasn't too much, and I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
We don't always need to be excellent. I definitely needed to hear that, and I'm really appreciative for this talk. I think many of us learned a lot about ourselves and our mental health over the course of lockdown, and I really appreciate Lauren coming to this stage and being so open and vulnerable. Thank you for that talk, Lauren. Even if you didn't always have to be excellent, you still were.